Hello, everyone. We're so excited to have you here today. We're just waiting a couple minutes to let some other people enter the webinar. But if you want to drop a hello in the chat, tell us where you're from, what you're excited to learn today. We got Kevin and Corey here from Arborjet as well, and we're really excited to meet you all. We'll just give it about one more minute, and we'll get started with just some overview and instructions, and then introduce Kevin. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us today. Another Chris from Alabama. And Chucky, our resident arborist at TCIA. Awesome. Everyone from all over, which is super fun. Great. It looks like we have a good chunk of the participants here today. So I'm going to kick it off. So good afternoon. My name is Kyla Cunningham, and I'm the Director of Corporate Engagement here at TCIA. Thank you so much for joining us today for a Business Solutions webinar on Intro to Integrated Pest Management with Arborjet Ecologel. Before I introduce our awesome speaker, some housekeeping. The presentation should last around 30 to 45 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. During the presentation, we are going to keep everyone muted except the speakers. You will have the ability to ask questions anytime during the presentation by utilizing the chat option. In fact, we encourage you to toss any and all related questions into the chat because our speaker will be keeping tabs on what you want to know. Each attendee will have the opportunity to receive a complimentary pocket guide that outlines common insects, diseases, and their treatments on 30 different trees. You'll have the chance to provide your address via a QR code during the presentation, and then Corey is also going to provide a link in the chat at the end. We will also be providing a quick survey at the end of the presentation that we would like to ask you to please respond to. Your feedback will help us improve future webinars. We will also be posting the recording of this webinar on the Business Solutions page of tcia.org, which will be posted in the next few days if you or others want to review anything mentioned today or share with someone else. Okay, now let's get to the good stuff. I'm very pleased to introduce Kevin Brewer. Kevin joined the Arborjet team in the summer of 2017 as the Northeast Regional Technical Manager, bringing with him years of industry experience and an extensive plant healthcare background. Prior to his role at Arborjet, Kevin served as the general manager of a tree preservation company, managing plant healthcare and the diagnoses and prescription of treatment for trees and shrubs. With a passion for saving trees, Kevin educates new and existing customers, keeping them ahead of the curve in their plant healthcare solutions. With 20 years of green industry experience, he is an ISA board certified arborist and an ASCA registered consulting arborist. Outside of Arborjet, he enjoys hiking, gardening, and traveling with his wife. TCIA is thrilled to have Kevin with us today to go over the intro to integrated pest management. And Kevin, with that, I will send it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much for the introduction. So we're going to be talking about integrated pest management today, and and this is a topic I'm pretty passionate about. I've been studying this for 20 years now, still learning, always growing in that, finding new ways to take care of problems. But in basic, what IPM is, and we're just kind of doing an introductory here for the first half hour, is it's a science-based approach to managing pests, using information about their life cycles and their interaction with the environment. Knowing that some trees, when they get under certain types of stress, are predisposed to more types of insects, different insects, and disease will have a different impact on them. So the ways we can go about having an integrated approach into, kind of battling some of those problems they might have is we have biological controls, which are beneficial insects, which we'll talk about a little more later. And you can either attract those naturally with diverse plantings, having year-round flowers going around, or you can buy them and introduce them into an environment as well. We have habitat manipulation. This is another great way I've taken to, integrated pest management is to kind of attract those beneficial insects. Sometimes you have to plant different varieties of plants especially when you have monocultural planting. So habitat manipulation would cover kind of putting new plants in the landscape to attract different insects, to attract different vectors. And then you have cultural practices, which covers your pruning techniques, over pruning trees or shearing trees. These can all stress plants out quite a bit and leave them predisposed to higher insect problems and being affected by them more severely. Picking resistant varieties, again, for new plantings, if you have, say some crab apples are very prone to apple cedar rust or apple scab, where some newer varieties are not so prone to those issues. So sometimes if you have a real pesticide averse client, you may just want to swap that out for a newer cultivar or a newer resistant variety to be able to avoid that problem in the future. And often that's a much more cost-effective approach for some issues in the long run. Um, Especially for some of them older varieties of crab apples that have a lot of issues. And then pesticides, we do have to intervene sometimes, especially in the beginning of setting up an IPM program, because you really won't have beneficial insects if there's not a population of things for them to feed on. But those populations can get so high, you really don't have time to wait for nature to balance out. So you might have to use a pesticide, whether a trunk injection, a spray, a soil treatment, and we'll talk about those different application methods a little later on. But you do have to intervene from time to time if you want to save some of the plants on the landscape. And especially when it comes down to serious pests like emerald ash borer, there are some issues that you really have no choice except to treat for or to plan on that tree declining and being removed in the end. So we'll go over those again in the end also. So what we're trying to do is build healthy trees. Um, and what is a healthy tree is a fantastic question. It's hard to find a good definition of that. But generally, a healthy tree is going to be tolerant of insect and disease pressure, but mostly of the native variety. If you have two-line chestnut borer, which is a native boring insect, it's related to emerald ash borer. But if you have that going after oak trees, birch, beech trees, hickories, things like that, an unhealthy tree is going to attract that pest, where a healthy tree is going to be able to fend itself off and not be under so much pressure from it. So that's one of the definitions of a healthy tree is it's able to maintain its presence in a landscape with native insects and disease pressure. Ability to withstand abiotic stresses. This is basically the tree's ability to, say, overcome a period of drought in the summer. It's got a deep enough root system. It has enough water storage capacity to kind of shrug off a drought or two and not go into immediate stress and decline the first time that happens. So they have proper physiological functioning. So there's nothing restricting water and nutrients from going up and down the stem and throughout the vascular system. So girdling roots can have an effect on that. And then they need a full dense canopy with good photosynthetic potential. So what that means is there's enough leaves to produce enough photosynthates to maintain that tree's canopy, store enough carbohydrates to refoliate the next year if it's a deciduous tree, and also have that energy to produce self-defense compounds. Like pine trees produce terpenes and resin, and that helps defend against boring insects. Um, Oaks have tannins, which is a very, very bitter substance to leaf-chewing caterpillars. So when they have that full photosynthetic potential, they have that abundant carbohydrate storage, which means they have the energy to do more than just get through the day-to-day. They actually have the energy to defend themselves. And kind of getting all those aspects down is what integrated pest management is about, is building that healthy tree. So here's a kind of the disease spiral, Manian's disease spiral. It's the effect of what small problems with a tree bring it down to what causes that dead tree in the middle. IPM focuses on the outside of this spiral. Once you get towards the center, that's where you have boring insects, and deadly diseases that are going after those weaker trees. So IPM is coming in the beginning to avoid things like soil characteristics affecting poor root growth, poor oxygen, poor water retention, getting proper mulch down to avoid drought conditions, and working in those predisposing factors before we have those serious pest issues where we have to kind of intervene. Trees that are already down that spiral, that's where we have to make the decision of what kind of pesticide we're going to use to stop that immediate problem when it happens, and then get to working on remediating some of those predisposing factors that got to the tree where the situation got so detrimental to its health. So an example of that in the real world would be ceridium canker on Leyland cypress. So that is brought on mostly by drought stress and shallow soils. And then you get this canker that causes a lot of dieback in branches. A way to prevent, say, that drought stress would be a proper layer of mulch, shallow soils. You could, incorporate air excavation to kind of till that up, loosen it up, get more organic matter in the soil, and make that plant a little more drought resistant, which is going to avoid the ceridium canker. Because once you have that canker in the tree and you start getting those big dieback areas, especially in evergreens, they're not very regenerative. So some of that damage can last quite a long time. So this is one of those issues you definitely want to try to avoid. It's much harder to come back and have a healthy plant after the fact. So beneficial insects, this is probably one of the most, I find, rewarding parts of the experience of IPM and implementing these programs is seeing beneficial insects is the success of putting all that together. It means you're not over applying pesticides, killing beneficial insects. You're allowing a light population of what could be considered harmful to the plant, but the beneficials are taking care of that for you rather than you having to intervene. Predatory mites, these are great. You can tell the difference with these if you get out your hand lens. Say you tap, we have Hinoki cypress, which gets mites sometimes when they're stressed out here. We get them a lot on arborvitae hedges near driveways where it's kind of hot and dusty. But if you get your hand lens out and look at them on a piece of paper, you'll see if there's different types of mites, the ones that are affecting the plant are pretty slow. If you see one that's skirting around pretty quick and its legs are a little bit longer, that's a predatory mite. They're very good at controlling low levels of mite populations. Now, if you have an explosion of a mite issue, say that pesticides have been over applied by a previous applicator or previous landscape management company, you may have to intervene to get that population down a little bit and then reintroduce predatory mites, which you can buy, to the situation to find balance afterwards. But I find that most of the time, if you look careful enough, you will find predatory mites there when you have other types of mite populations. Green lacewing. This is one where we're understanding how these beneficial insects interact in the landscape has a big part to do with it. So with green lacewing, it's the larvae that's a beneficial insect. They feed on aphids, thrips, whiteflies, leafhoppers, spider mites. They feed on a lot of different pests in the landscape. However, as an adult, they feed on nectar, pollen, and honeydew. So you're not going to attract a green lacewing just by having a pest like you will with predatory mites. They only eat mites. But green lacewing, you have to have a population of plants that's flowering throughout the season to attract the adult that will then lay its eggs, and then that larvae will then eat the aphids, spider mites, leafhoppers, and things of that nature. So it's kind of two things you need to have in tandem to attract a green lacewing as a beneficial insect. So one of the ways when I first started designing landscapes, you can read a lot of books on when plants flower and this, that, and the other, but I kind of designed my first few landscapes on knowing I needed plants flowering from as early in the season to as late in the season as possible. So I would just go to the home and garden centers and just look at what plants they were selling in flower for that month. And then kind of just staying in touch with home and garden centers, keeping an eye on different people's properties and seeing how those are interacting. You can build up a good collection of plants that are flowering year round, which is very attractive to the customer, but it's also very attractive to beneficial insects. So assassin bugs, these ones are something you can buy. They're not so much something you attract naturally here in the Northeast very easily. But what's great about these is why they call them assassin bugs, is they are predatory insects and beneficial insects through all life stages. So as a larva and an adult, they're going to feed on aphids, mealybugs, thrips, small caterpillars, and they thrive in high temperatures and with low humidity. So they're in a wide range of the country to use. They have a high reproduction rate. But what's best about them is how they got the nickname the assassin bug is they kill well beyond just what they need to eat. If they see aphids wandering around, they're just going to start killing them even after they're full. So they're a fantastic predatory insect, and one that you can purchase quite easily online and introduce into your landscapes. And then beneficial nematodes, these are one that are almost always purchased. And these are used a lot more in lawn care than tree care, but they're very host specific. So you can buy specific nematodes that work on Japanese beetle larvae in the soil. There's some that just target queen ants and ant populations, cutworms, armyworms, crane flies. So what they do is they just kind of, they get into the body of the pest and then they reproduce in there and then just thousands more come out of that one pest looking for more of it. They do need soil moisture. These don't like dry environments. But if you have good soil moisture, these can move quite easily through the soil profile, kind of hunting for that pest that you're trying to control. But with the beneficial nematodes, you do have to match them very specifically to what pest you're trying to control. They're not too broad of a hunter. They're kind of specific in their nature. So the biggest impact I find in integrated pest management that we can have is working with urban soils, which have many poor qualities to them, but it's a leading predisposing factor to decline in most of our managed landscapes. We're working more with urban soils than natural soils. So what we're looking for is a healthy soil, which has a strong structure and it should hold together well, wet or dry. We've all seen, when you see curb lines or, when you pull up on the side of somebody's driveway on a dry day, all that dirt is just kind of dusty and you can move that around. That means there's not really any organic matter in there, and it's certainly not being used for any plant life. If there's any root at all growing into that soil, it's going to hold it together from turning into dust when it's dry out. So if you get into a landscape and you see that kind of whole area along the driveway, along the front, it could be from salt damage in the northeast. Plants aren't thriving there. It's an unhealthy soil, and it's gonna fall apart very easily when touched. But you want good water infiltration, so you don't want a hydrophobic soil, but it needs to be able to infiltrate through larger pores in the soil, but be retained in smaller pockets in the soil. So you need a good draining soil so you have oxygen availability and water availability. And you need an abundant, diverse biological community. So you need bacteria and fungi. Fungi are very symbiotic with trees, um, but they perform best when the tree is healthy, the soil is healthy, and they can all work together. Poor soils are not healthy for microbial activity. Um, but to be healthy, they require an adequate cover from not just dead, but living plant material. So we don't want to just put a mulched desert around a plant to try to improve soil health. Yes, that will decompose and add organic matter, but you do need a diverse biological community below ground and above. So having different types of plants attract different types of mycorrhizal fungi. So the more diverse of a planting you can have, the more diverse of a community you can have in the soil also to help break down that dead material. So we don't want just kind of mulch deserts for benefit. We want diverse plantings and mulch together. And healthy soil has to be able to effectively release nutrients and water with the plant. So that's where organic matter comes in. That's what helps really retain a lot of moisture in the soil much longer through shorter drought periods. So what we find in urban soils is a lot of compaction, which limits the amount of oxygen that can be in the soil. Oxygen can move through soil with good pore space almost instantly. There's the same amount of oxygen in the atmospheric air as there is below ground when there's good pore space. As soon as that's compacted, oxygen can't get through solid material like stone, clay, and things like that. You need that pore space. Um, Organic matter, again, lacking most often in the urban environment because we're always cleaning up lawn clippings. We're not having a lot of nutrient recycling. So it's highly disturbed. It's been plowed and piled and flattened and leveled, and it lacks the ability to exchange and hold nutrients. So there's things we can do with that synthetically using kind of soil amendment type products like molasses or hygroscopic humectants and humates, which is more of kind of an advanced IPM talk, which we get into at some other times. But that's generally what we see in urban soils is kind of a lack of those things that you would find just if you walk into the forest where you can feel the soil has almost a squishiness to it. It's got so much, porosity to it, where compacted urban soils are very dense. And the effects of that is it reduces the growth potential. So your incremental growth on an oak tree in healthy soil, year to year, they could grow 6 inches. In a compacted soil, you might see year over year, they're only growing about an inch or two. You'll get heightened pest pressure, a reduced ability to produce photosynthates through the leaves. They're really struggling. They can't take up enough water and nutrients, and they tend to have some tip dieback and some decline. So one of the best ways we can address that is with supersonic air knife or air excavation at high speed, lower pressure, but high volume. So using these air excavation equipment, they're coming out of the equipment about Mach 1.7, which is very fast, usually around 90 PSI, but 185 cubic feet per minute. So it's a high volume of air. And that helps break up compacted soils. It'll exploit any kind of crack in the soil there is, or just the friction on the soil and kind of break that apart, but it doesn't do damage to the roots of the plant. So you'll be able to use these for many uses, which we'll get into further here. So things that you can do with them, vertical mulching, radial trenching, rejuvenation, root crown inspections, installing irrigation near trees without damaging plants. So many good uses for soil excavation around trees, um, other than just remediating soil, but avoiding stress in other projects. So vertical mulching, this is something that's extremely beneficial to trees. Um, for the input, basically. So there's kind of three stages of using air excavation to reinvigorate soil. Vertical mulching is kind of step one, but it's very effective in if you have a customer that really likes their turf and their tree, and you try to get rid of the turf and do a mulch bed with diverse plantings, and where you can't under the drip edge, vertical mulching is nice because you're basically doing a 3 by 3 foot grid pattern and decompacting as much as you can in that 3 by 3 grid, like one cylinder, maybe 3 inch diameter, getting 2 or 3 feet deep, and then 3 feet later, doing another one of those holes, but working in a lawn panel, you're not disrupting much turf, but you're really fracking the soil out from those, and you can work in some compost or some biochar, some other types of amended soils, and kind of mix that with the native soil and get a lot of benefit for drainage and oxygen into the soil. Um, and it's the least amount of effort for a good amount of benefit. So you also, if you have customers that don't have as much money to do a complete soil remediation or soil invigoration process, it's beneficial with low impact. So radial trenching is kind of the next step up in that process. And on the picture on the right, you can see basically that's just doing trenches out like the spokes on a wheel. We're trying to get 8 to 10 inches wide, 8 to 10 inches deep on those trenches. And this is going to allow roots to really grow away from the tree. It helps avoid girdling roots in the future. And also if you have kind of an interface between the type of material the tree came with, say it's balled and burlapped in clay, and you're putting it in a sandy soil, getting that radial trenching out is kind of going to help break up that soil interface between the two and allow the roots to expand past that. You can also, again, work in soil amendments and compost. Works well on small trees and large. Helps with drainage. On larger trees, when you get farther away from the trunk, I tend to start more trenches. So on a smaller tree, you might start, say, with these 6 or 8. But as you get 10, 12 feet out from the tree, as those get 8 or 10 feet apart, I'd start another one in the middle on larger trees and try to get to the drip edge on larger trees. Or if you have a fastigiate type species, like a fastigiate beech or a slender silhouette sweet gum, you want to look more at the height of the tree rather than the canopy spread. So you want to go either the height of the tree or the canopy spread, whichever is greater when possible. You want to get to those distances, but really anything the customer is going to give you or what fits in their budget is going to be helpful. So just, work with what you can when you see those trees not living up to their genetic potential. Um, Obviously there's some, you have to know what kind of variety the tree is, make sure it's not a dwarf variety if it's growing less than you might expect it to. But know the variety and the species, the cultivar, and then you can say, I know this tree is supposed to grow 4 to 6 inches a year. You can look at the bud scars, so you can find the internodal growth on those plants, and you can see if it's living up to that potential or not. If it's not, it's most likely a soil issue, whether it's lacking nutrients, water, or oxygen availability, and then work these systems in. And then there's soil rejuvenation, or where you're doing kind of the whole area. You're decompacting the soil for about 10 inches under the entire drip edge of the plant. It's the most expensive because it is the most labor, but it's extremely beneficial to the entire area. It helps the tree, and you only have to do it once when done appropriately. A lot of these amendments only need to be done once. The radial trenching, the decompacting, if you work in organic matter and get, you know, biochar can be helpful as well, and get that soil healthy and avoid it from being recompacted, building that mulch bed and getting plantings in there just to make sure there's not lawn equipment driving over those root zones anymore. If it's in a park, I've designed a couple landscapes where if it's a significant tree, do 3/4 of the tree as a planting bed and leave one area of access so people can still come up to a significant tree and interact with it, but they won't come at it from all angles and get back the soil with foot traffic or parking. So you can kind of design those for traffic flow also, how you work around trees. Root crown inspections, girdling roots is the #1 thing probably getting looked for in root crown inspections. Um, Often from the nursery, plants are coming planted a little too deep or with some predisposed factors like containerized plants that cause girdling roots. You don't want to necessarily try to cut all of them at once when there's a lot of them. It may take a couple seasons. Um, if you look at the diameter of a tree, kind of look down at it like it's like a circle. So you take a 6-inch diameter tree, looking down on that. you wouldn't want to cut more roots that would fill 1/4 of that area. If you see a tree that needs more roots cut than that, you'd want to come back season over season and do that slowly, or you can shock them a little too much. And then consider a plant growth regulator after root pruning, just like you would possibly after construction damage. You don't want that tree trying to grow outwardly when it should just be focusing a little bit more on root growth. So you can retard that outward growth a little bit and let it kind of regrow that root system a little bit more efficiently. Bare root transplanting. If you do transplant in the environment, that does put a lot of stress on trees. So bare root transplanting, you can bring a lot more of the root mass with the plant than you would traditionally digging, with the soil. So you can see here, these whips are kind of pulled out and then kind of just straw around them, a little bit of burlap, tie those roots into whips so you can tie them up to the trunk. And you can contain those well even over further distances. And those plants are going to establish much quicker, which avoids future pest issues, especially on, again, those native plants getting attacked by native pests. The faster you get a tree to establish, the better. So bare root transplanting, I'm a pretty big fan of when possible, and also in established landscapes. Um, it's much more beneficial if a situation's been overplanted, which is quite common. You want the planting to look good right away, but 10 years down the road, say you have to move one of those plants out. You've got the hollies, the lilacs, the azaleas, they're all too close. With bare root transplanting, you can not damage the roots of all the trees nearby and kind of pull the one out that you want to replant somewhere else and save all the plants instead of picking your favorite. So bare root transplanting is a great idea also in established landscapes to do less root damage. So this is just a picture of doing some radial trenching after, some new construction on a house addition was put in. So there's obviously some construction compaction. You want to put up a little bit of a barrier when you're doing air excavation. Kind of think of it like stump grinding. It will fling some rocks and pebbles a little bit of a distance. So you want to protect if there's any, cars nearby, windows, doors. Make sure you're kind of taking note of that. And then again, when you're doing that radial trenching, 6 to 8 inches wide, 6 to 12 inches deep, as far as you can go.
Hey,
And
Kevin,
then, yes,
if we can stop just now, we have a burning question that one of the guests have, just to
sure.
kind of give a moment. In your slides, you continue to present on doing some soil excavation work, and you talk about amendments and applying compost and a plant growth regulator after. Can you speak briefly to the use of compost teas in the landscape? I know we could both talk for hours on it, but maybe just a pro and a con.
So compost teas are great because there's a lot of biological activity in them. You do have to, mix them appropriately, but also you have to make sure you're getting that compost tea and having the right beneficials to match what the tree wants. So you want to make sure the compost, if you're trying to use compost tea on an oak, you wouldn't want to start that with a compost that was under a pine. They have very different relationships with fungi. So they are beneficial when matched appropriately. So it does take a little bit of work and a little bit of forethought. But yes, you would be immediately introducing beneficial products to that tree when matched appropriately.
Thank you so much. I think that covers it, and that covers my relationship with the compost tea product line as well. So thank you, sir.
Great. So this is just also using an air-powered vacuum. When you are taking that soil out to amend it, even when you're working around trees, you want to make sure you're not just loosening that soil up and then trying to take a shovel to dig it out, because then you're still going to do root damage. So again, taking that loosened soil out to amend it and reapply it or replace it, or if there's just too much of it, you want to remove it in the least damaging way to the tree as possible. So now we're at the point where, say we have a problem where we do have to use a medicinament, pesticide, or have chemical intervention. Treatment methods are very important. They vary greatly between foliar cover sprays or different types of injection or soil drenching products. We want to pick the one that has the least impact on the surrounding environment and what's going to give us the best, fastest, or longest residual on the pest we're trying to control. Sometimes we want to have a product with a very short residual. We want to be able to, say you have spongy moth on an oak tree. We might want to just knock that pest down quickly, but make sure we don't have a long residual in the plant that might harm other insects in the area. Or maybe we want to use if we use a cover spray, we don't want to use a broad spectrum product. Maybe we want to use something a little more pointed. So those are all kind of considerations to take in. So treatment options, if you're going to do a foliar spray, I try to go more towards botanical solutions rather than these non-botanical solutions like acephate, pyrethrins, carbaryl, some of these broad spectrum products that you're going to spray into the environment, they could last quite a while, and they're basically just going to wipe out all insect activity in a given area. And once you kill the beneficials, you're going to have a problem first before the beneficials come back to control it. So you want to be as targeted as possible when doing foliar applications. So using botanical solutions like BT, which is a Bacillus thuringiensis, those work great for Lepidoptera, some caterpillars. Azadirachtin, which are insect growth regulators, can be very good. They're not going to affect, some of these sprays affect what's there today, what's not necessarily going to be there tomorrow. So having a good idea exactly what pest you're trying to treat for and what pests you don't want to have an effect on will help you better select what products you want to use as a foliar spray. Since this is a kind of a presentation from coast to coast, there's not too many specifics here on that just because there's so many variables from what part of the country you're from. But there are very targeted products out there nowadays where if you know the problem, you know the pest, you know the beneficials, you can usually find a way to do that with a pretty light touch when doing a foliar, or sometimes that's when chunk injections come into a benefit because you're only affecting that one tree, not the surrounding area. So sprays, basically the equipment you have does kind of limit how high you can spray in a tree. Spraying 90-foot tall trees is difficult, and it does affect a very wide area. You will get drift even when you're trying to avoid it, and you'll get pesky neighbors with spraying in urban areas. Even if you're just spraying water on a tree, you're gonna draw a lot of attention. So it's best used on small trees and shrubs, under 20 feet in height. And wind can have a great effect on this also, and leaf size. A lot of spring issues, the leaves are very tender when we have those issues. You have to be very careful when spraying a tree, or you can just cause, physical damage to those parts as well. Soil applications, the equipment's very cheap to do it. Some people use a bucket, or you can use a specified soil injection piece of equipment that's highly metered, and you're doing a lot of it, which is very efficient. But a lot of people use neonics for this. And again, those are very broad spectrum, and they have high acreage limitations because of their ability to get through the soil and get into groundwater, as well as have an effect on pollinators. But the restriction per acreage is more about their ability to get into groundwater. So you can't use much of it as a soil drench. You don't really see a lot of this as much in pest control anymore, as soil drenching of pesticides. It's more of an older way of going about things. But you can still see it with phosphites for some disease control, plant health elicitors, things like that can be soil applied quite effectively. And also products can move a little bit slowly through the soil profile on trees. If you're in drought and you put down a soil applied product, it's not going to get into that tree very quickly. And if you have too much water, it could run it out of the soil profile before the tree has a chance to get it. So they are also weather dependent. You have to keep an eye on the product and that. So tree injection, kind of the other application method. Nice things about it is you're not limited on the equipment to the size of the tree like you are with spraying. Same piece of equipment is going to treat a 15-foot tall tree as a 100-foot tall tree. It's sealed in the tree. There's nothing in the soil, the air. So you're only affecting that tree that you're treating right there. You're not going to affect the beneficial insects on the tree or around the tree, just what's feeding on that tree. And there's a great reduced exposure to applicators and the public. So in urban environments, it's a great application method to not cause a big disturbance to the area. And we can get some pretty good residuals with a lot of the injected products. And this is where a lot of the new research in the industry is going, is finding new chemistries to use in an injection manner. So always, again, pick that treatment method with the lowest impact on the surrounding area and the most pointed product to the problem you have. I just like this photo. If you have praying mantises on your property, they're a controversial pest. Some are invasive, some are native, but they are a top tier predatory insect. So if you see those around, you've got a healthy environment. You've got a good balance of insects and larger predators on the property. So they're kind of a sign of success when you see these guys. So planting zones are another thing to consider. This is kind of moving into the future. What do we do as we're installing new plants? Between 1990 and 2015, you can see they have adjusted the USDA planting zones. We still do have cold snaps, but we have to figure as things move forward, the planting projection zones from the USDA vary greatly based on different scenarios that are not known. We don't know what the carbon inputs into the atmosphere are going to be, how that's going to interact in every way. So planting trees for the future can be difficult, especially with memorial trees. What are we going to do versus scenario A or C, which has a 3 planting zone difference? But there are trees we can select. Like here in the Northeast, I know right now hickory does very well. So if the climate doesn't change much, hickory is going to be a great option for a memorial planting. But if it changes to the worst case scenario, hickory does fantastic in Georgia and Alabama as well. So I know that's a heat tolerant, drought tolerant, and cold tolerant plant. So as a memorial tree, I'm looking at things that can live through a multitude of these scenarios when I'm looking for a 100-year tree. Because species are generally moving north in the forest. We see currently we have a mix of spruce fir up in the further northeast, but that's going more towards maple beech and oak hickory. Oak is having a little bit of trouble naturally regenerating in some forest environments, but when planted in an urban landscape, we're not worried about its ability to naturally regenerate. They're doing very well in natural environments, and they're adaptable to what the climate scenarios could be one way or the other. And native versus non-native is another big question that we get in selecting plants. And we do like to plant native plants when possible. They attract and are beneficial to the most amount of insects, birds, animals. They're fantastic, but we have to know we've altered the native environment so much in some areas, especially urban areas. We may not be able to select a native plant that's going to do well in our non-native environment. So if we're looking at stormwater retention, lowering temperatures just through their transpiration or shade, pick a plant that's going to do well because non-native is very different than invasive. We shouldn't always be afraid to plant a non-native tree, especially working in non-native environments. Native is defined just as longitude, latitude, but the heat island effect of some cities changes what that is like to the tree, how it perceives it greatly. So native when possible, yes. Non-native, we're still going to get a lot of benefits if that's what's going to do best in that environment. And then the USDA has expectations for every area, what trees will expect to decline from disease and insects versus trees that will do better because of higher humidity, things like that. So eastern white pines are very sensitive to high humidity throughout the summer. We're seeing a lot of decline in white pines in the Northeast. And that's due to the humidity. It's natural diseases, but they're just more prevalent because of that. But we see more health in black gum, which I think is a beautiful tree. The hickories, a lot of oaks, those are doing very well. So every area has its own little section on the USDA website to see, what their predictions are for your environment. And then the last section we'll get to today is the serious pest and disease issues. These are the unfortunate situations. Mostly these are invasive or introduced diseases and pests to the country where you really can't healthy soil or beneficial insect your way out of these problems. You have to know what the pest is and what trees they go after and how to manage those. Or they can be very serious on the landscape and trees can decline and die even in healthy environments. I'd say emerald ash borer is probably the most popular example of that pest. If you have emerald ash borer within 10 to 30 miles of a property that you're managing and you have ash, you have to start planning on whether you're going to treat that tree or, basically give the homeowner the ultimatums of if you do nothing, nature is going to decide within 10 years, and this tree is not likely to survive. And they get very brittle when they die from emerald ash borer. So it's good to be able to explain those factors to a homeowner where there's this, sometimes you need to use a pesticide to maintain a plant in the landscape or have to expect to remove that tree. And emerald ash borer is a great example of that. We see it in a lot of municipalities, especially out west, where they planted a lot of ash to replace elm when they died in the 50s and 60s. So they have, unfortunately, these monocultural plantings, but so much of their canopy is ash, they can't afford to lose it. So, they do have to treat for that pest, and they do it quite successfully. The city, some cities out west treat tens of thousands of ash trees successfully for the last 15 plus years. So, the treatments are extremely effective. You can keep that canopy, but if they stop, they know they're going to end up losing that. So same thing in smaller landscapes. You just have to understand the pest and the tree and know that you do have to treat sometimes. And then know what you can save. Once you have 60% thinning on an ash from EAB, generally this is a tree, when you get a lot of this strong epicormic growth lower down, there's a lot of damage at that point. But 30% thinning, this tree in the background here, very savable trees. You can treat therapeutically as well as preventatively with this pest. It doesn't have to just be preventatively. You can intervene once it's already there also. But they can come through quite quickly. This is the same street, 2011, 2013. This town decided not to do a lot. Now that's a lot of liability right there, a lot of dead trees on that street. So, you do have to kind of get at this pest when you know it's there. And it's similar with a lot of other invasives as they move in, like hemlock woolly adelgid. There are some beneficial beetles for this, but on that moving front, the population can be so high, you do have to treat for this. And hemlock is such a keystone species in the native environment. We've seen in Pennsylvania where swaths of hemlock have died from hemlock woolly adelgid. You get a lot less stormwater retention, which floods local streams and rivers much quicker in these high moisture events, which we get a little more common now, these flooding events, and it wipes out the trout population. So hemlock woolly adelgid has an effect on even trout. So we have to understand kind of the environmental impact these insects can have also in choosing whether or not to manage them or just let nature take its course. So we do have to intervene quite often if we want to keep a little bit of balance out there, even for something like an insect in a tree affecting a fish species. So what they look like, knowing the signs, it's just a white, snowy-like look on hemlock. And then over time, they get discolored and thin. But an injection of imidacloprid can give you 5 to 7 years of control for this pest on one treatment. Easily treated for, long residuals, injectable, so you can do it near water where they like to live, and get great control on this pest. It's one that's easily solved, but a tree that really has a high impact when it leaves our native environment. We have pine bark beetles, whether it's Ips beetles or black turpentine beetles or southern pine beetles. Some of these will also affect healthy trees. Some prefer trees in decline. Black turpentine beetle does like stressed out trees. Southern pine beetle, once you get a high population of those, aggressive, they can kill healthy trees. So when you see pockets of southern pine beetle, usually you have to really try to contain that pest when it gets to a higher population. And then try to keep healthy plants in the landscape. Sometimes, in larger areas of the forest, they do a little bit of thinning. And what that does is then wind can get into the forest and disperse the hormones that the beetles release to attract other beetles. So they can't find each other as well. So that's why they do forest thinning for southern pine beetle. Out west, the Ips beetles are definitely a bigger problem. They can go after over 25 different species of trees in the west. But you can have very good control with them with an injection of emamectin benzoate to get 2-year control. They're very destructive, and as we have a warming climate, they're getting to higher altitudes. So they're getting into new environments where the tree hasn't been pressured by that pest in the past. So it is one you have to consider as it moves higher in elevation and across different landscapes. Some ways bark beetles have been managed in the past is with foliar sprays with pesticides that have a residual on the bark. So as they try to chew in, they get killed, like using pyrethroids and things like that. But even with a light breeze, these move. You can get a lot of drifting, and those are tend to be longer lasting pesticides. So if you try to control bark beetles, generally you're going to cause a big disruption to the environment if you're using a foliar cover spray. Where the Texas Forest Service has done research on trunk injection with emamectin benzoate for bark beetles, and you get very good control for several seasons and not having to have an effect on the larger population. So again, having a pest that you may have no choice but to treat for, but also combining that with treating the best treatment method to not have an impact on the surrounding area, really comes together on pine bark beetles. Then we have oak wilt. It affects red oaks, the red oak family and the white oak family, but it affects them differently. Red oaks can go into decline and die within 3 months when exposed to oak wilt, where live oaks and white oaks can take a couple seasons to decline. But it's primarily spread underground through root grafts and by nididulid beetles on fresh cuts on trees. So if you have oak wilt present nearby in your areas, you want to avoid pruning oaks February throughout the growing season when possible, because those nididulid beetles are attracted to the fungi under the bark of the dying trees, as well as fresh cuts on oak trees in pruned areas. So knowing how to prune the trees properly at the right time, and then knowing this is an aggressive pathogen in the black oak family, you can treat the white oaks a little more better therapeutically because the red oaks and black oaks decline so quickly. But treating, once you find it, you want to treat all the trees around it. And sometimes even in Michigan, they do trenching around the trees to sever those root grafts. There's a lot less pressure on the trees that still have a chance. And these are these fungal mats under the bark on the red oak. It's a very good telltale sign that it was oak wilt that did that. They're also hard to find though. But if you do see one, it's kind of neat just to check it out. But this is what those nitidula beetles are attracted to under the bark. They get under there, get the spores all over them, and then they go to the fresh cuts on those prune trees or trees that get spring storm damage from, microbursts and things of that nature. For palm trees, especially out in Hawaii, we have coconut rhinoceros beetle. Just an insect that's not supposed to be there. It's huge, but you do have to treat for this. There are, natural ways. They've looked into trying to, basically raise soil temperatures to try to kill larvae, but it's just not feasible on scale. So this is another one that, for out west, especially Hawaii, if coconut rhinoceros beetle is a problem in your area, it's a pest that you do have to treat for, or you will risk losing those palms. So in review, IPM is about taking in the whole picture, knowing how's the environment interacting with that tree? How are beneficial insects interacting with destructive insects? Knowing what kind of diseases may be seasonal versus what kind of diseases may be every single year just because a plant is susceptible. Look for the root of the problem, pun intended. Get down in there in the dirt, see if that soil is compacted, see if it feels the same as it would in the forest. So maintain those healthy soils, manage moisture, whether through it's like a hygroscopic humectant as an additive or having proper mulch cover and proper shade on the soil by having diverse plantings. Know your serious issues, know what you can't know what you can't just watch your way out of and prevent. There are those issues that you do have to treat for. And the more trees, the better. They're diverse, they're inspiring. I love this oak on the left, even though unfortunately it is no longer with us. It did tip over in a storm. But keeping those trees healthy, that tree on the left is inspiring to me. It's like a religious experience for me when I go under that tree. It connects me to nature. It inspires me to try to keep trees healthy for longer generations. I don't walk by 4-inch diameter oaks and have a religious experience like I would under these mature trees. So we got to get them to full experience, full life, full health, native plants. A lot of things we can do to help build those healthy landscapes. So with that, I thank you. My contact information is here. You can also ask in the chat for it. And we also have complimentary pocket guides going out after this. So you can scan the QR code. Corey's going to pop a link in the chat also. And with that, I thank you for tuning in and listening to us today, and we'll be able to take any questions.
Awesome, Kevin. Good work. We've been fending off a handful of the questions that have come on in. So folks, if anybody else has questions, please do type them into the chat. We've got a couple that folks have sent me personally. I think we'll keep them anonymous, but the first one was actually posed a couple minutes ago, talking about a city in Wisconsin that's been treating a large amount of ash trees for almost 20 years. This individual believes there seems to be some sort of decline that's occurring. Is there anything that cities like this or other people who are taking care of the urban forests can add to that treatment of triage or other IPM approaches that they can take to help encourage a healthier plant?
Certainly. So knowing why the tree may be in decline, with emerald ash borer, it's the most common problem. So a lot of times you treat for EAB and you're like, tree is good, I've solved the problem. But there still could be those urban soil problems on the tree that are building up over time. As those trees get larger, they're more susceptible to those problems in the urban environment. So that tree is going to be easier stressed out than they were 20 years ago when you started treating for it. Now you've got 20 years extra growth in the same possibly restricted soil profile. So it may have more nutrient deficiencies. You could do a little bit of a soil test to make sure, that's in need. If the tree is chlorotic, there's also injectable iron and manganese solutions that you can use at the same time. So knowing how it's being affected, but yeah, as that tree gets 20 years past the first time you treated it, it is also more susceptible just to the urban environment.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate how you put that in. Another question that was sent to me directly is, how should I be selling these IPM? Should I sell them as a service, as a single treatment? What would you suggest?
So you're selling it as a whole program, not as a single treatment. Basically, as we've always tried to build relationships with our customers. So they know us, they call us. When they see something, they say something. So we're going to sell IPM in a way as we want to build a relationship with their property. We want to be able to see how plants are interacting with each other, how we can intervene to reduce pesticide applications, have a property that can maintain itself healthily and more naturally. So we're just kind of extending that, relationship we build with customers to relationships we build with properties. And they really take to that, saying, I want to make sure this is just a healthy plant that's going to be able to withstand drought and resist disease better.
And Kevin, I'm glad you said that, because that is the ultimate goal from this integrated approach, is that over time, this plant, the soil, everything will be able to resist those pests, going back to one of your first slides. So good call on that. The next one relates, and this is obviously we're doing this with TCI. So they talk about, how does this help? How does IPM help grow my business? What can I expect, either from a renewal or business valuation perspective?
So as far as a business perspective for IPM, it's much more repeatable and it's less exhausting on the customer, and how they look at plant healthcare. So if you have armored scale problem on a stressed out tree, and you're treating that armored scale every single year with a pesticide, it's on your program, you're going to come every May and you're going to spray that tree. Eventually the customer is going to be like, why aren't we ever beating this problem? They're going to say, I'm just tired of this plant. Maybe I'll just get rid of this tree. I won't have to use pesticides all the time. Where if you move that to an IPM approach, you're not doing the same exact thing every single year that can fatigue the customer. You're also not using expensive products. Pesticides are probably the second biggest expense after labor in plant healthcare for a business. So it's a less expensive treatment method over time, but it doesn't exhaust the customers as much because they're not spending money on the same exact thing over and over again and never solving the problem. And also you'll retain that customer better because you change their landscape and how they thought about the problem.
Yeah, and you're actually being that professional that's out there that can help address that problem and see the
Yeah.
value. Can the second half of that question is, as companies look at their valuation, obviously it's not much of a surprise that a company that does IPM or plant healthcare will have a higher market value because of those margins, because of that renewable service. But Kevin, also because that's what, as people are looking for succession and selling their businesses, that's what private equity and other folks are looking into, because of that predictable income. So yeah, I think that's huge. One final question that I've got over on this end, and folks, if you're still here and listening, please type anything into the chat. But one other one is, where can I learn more about IPM and local pests, which is one that I love.
So there's several ways. I would say know your industry reps, know your local Arborjet territory regional manager. They're going to be in tune with what pests need to be treated for, which is versus which ones, you can healthy soil your way out of, basically. They'll know the diverse plantings that work better in your environment. Stay involved in your arboricultural organizations like the TCI, like ISA. Maybe being in a nursery and landscapers association as well, to learn a little bit more about plant diversity. So, I found everybody thinks sometimes the more you talk about plant healthcare, some other business might try to steal your model or something. But I find the more knowledge we spread as an industry together, the better. So talk to your peers, be involved in organizations, and know your industry representatives.
That's awesome, Kevin. Obviously, Arborjet's got a whole host of webinars that people can tune into, and then local
Yeah,
extensions.
absolutely.
CSU in Colorado seems to be pretty good in the authority here. So, folks in this area, please check that out. See if there are any other ones that just came in. Looks like some people doing a little self-promotion. Totally fine. All right. Looks like we might have another one. Kyla, do you want to pop on?
Oh, no, I was just saying we did have one from Scott about the spruce and aspen trees. Did you see that one come through?
Yeah, I'm reading it now. All right.
Okay.
So, question posed by an individual: if you have 10 spruce trees and 10 aspens, where aphids, spruce scale, Ips beetle, Marcinona are all present, how would you sell the IPM to the client to cover all these treatments and more? How many visits throughout the season? For example, we're here in Colorado, and treat from April to October. This might be too specific of a question, but curious to how to sell it accordingly. I'm pretty familiar with all these pests, Kevin.
That sounds like a you question. Yeah, that's you, man.
Awesome. So Scott, each of these pests that you have listed here, obviously they're affecting different tree species and they require their own treatments. So for the most part, that foliar pest that you're talking about on aspens, the timing for that's going to be depending on what treatment option you choose, but that's going to be really early spring. As it relates to spruce scale, we have a couple here in Colorado. That's once again depending on your treatment method is either going to be done mid to late May or possibly when they crawl in early June, once again, depending on which exact scale you have. So you could be at a property, and Kevin will attest to this as he was building plant healthcare programs. You could be at a property 3-4 times in a season for different applications. Kevin, up in the Northeast, you guys see a lot of foliar fungi, but you also see a lot of pests that are feeding on the leaves. How do most plant healthcare managers on the East Coast manage something like this where there are additional opportunities?
Yeah, when there's a lot more than one problem on the landscape, you mean how do you start working with the whole landscape?
Correct.
Depends. If it's a new customer, and I go and say I'm at a new customer's property and I see 5 different problems, I'll pick the one that is the most visually displeasing, as well as the one that I know is damaging to the tree, and get a good win for the customer to see, instead of overwhelming them with 10 different problems. If one I know isn't going to be a problem for 4 or 5 years, that tree can handle it for a while, I can deal with it with healthy soil later. I try to build properties like that. If it's existing customers, I just know how often I have to be there for what problem. Sometimes you have to be at a property 7 times a year. But the best part about IPM is once you find a balance, you don't have to just go to properties on nice days when you can do applications. You can go on days when it's windy, a little bit wet, and do some monitoring and still make some money.
I'm so glad you said that. And also, change up your treatment methods. I think an individual like this or an opportunity like this, I think a lot of companies, as you're just starting out, automatically the first thing you're going to is, all right, well, we've got these pests, these are the contact sprays. We're showing up on a 4 to 6 week interval where you may have better opportunities by changing that application method and maybe some different chemistries. And something like a needle scale on spruce, you can show up and do one treatment a year. And aphids, that's 1 or 2 contact sprays or a soil application. So really, you might not have to be there as often as what initially you think. So let me see if there's any other thing else. I know the chat kind of lags here just for a second. So folks, once again, if you're still here, quick reminder, sign up for that pocket guide, either do a QR code scan or hit one of the links that we've been plopping in. Also, it looks like our team at TCIA has plugged in the link so you can listen to this webinar over and over and over again. But you only get one CEU.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin and Corey. That was an awesome presentation. I'm just going to wrap it up. Honestly, and thank you for Arborjet Ecologel. They're a TCIA Gold sponsor for your time today, their expertise, and their support of the industry in TCIA. If you all have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact us at businesssolutions@tcia.org to speak with one of our team members, or I'm sure Corey and Kevin will share their contact information in the chat. As a reminder, please complete the survey that you will receive shortly and be sure to provide your address via the link provided if you would like to receive the complimentary pocket guide. And please check out the newly revamped tcia.org to see what else is happening in the coming weeks. We'll hope you will join us for 2 upcoming webinars in February, Building the Model Tree Care Business with TCIA Accreditation on February 20th, and How to Complete EHAP Online in 1 Day on February 27th. Registration is already open, so click the link in the chat or go to tcia.org to sign up. Otherwise, have a great evening, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.